Have prophets and prophecy figured prominently in Christian tradition?
Christianity grew at least initially out of Jewish tradition, in which the prophets of the Old Testament played a central role. A prophetess named Anna was in the temple when Mary and Joseph presented their child there to fulfill the law, and proclaimed Jesus the salvation of Jerusalem, Luke 2:36-38. Jesus himself was very much a part of that prophetic heritage. He and his contemporaries wondered about the spiritual identity of Jesus' cousin John, the Baptist. Many consider John a prophet, Mark 11:32, and Jesus told his followers that John was indeed a prophet. But even more, he was the very Elijah whose return had been foretold, Matthew 11:11-15. The Gospels report that many identified Jesus, too, as the expected prophet, and that Jesus even hinted that they were correct, c.e.g. Matthew 10:41, 13:57, 21:11. Pauline letters list prophets as belonging to a rank or office second only to that of apostle, suggesting that prophecy continued to play an important role after Jesus' death, e.g. Corinthians 12:28, Ephesians 4:11. It is not clear in those cases how these prophets functioned. Long after the age of biblical prophecy, some Christians have identified modern saints as prophets who have raised their voices in opposition to oppression and injustice. Such courageous people are, therefore, spokespersons for God in our time, thus fulfilling the role of prophets of old. Many are tempted to regard prophecy as a synonym for foretelling the future. But that has never been the primary role of prophets.
Who are the principal deities in CIT?
CIT's formal recognition of members of its pantheon went through many changes over the course of more than 3,000 years. Here are some of the principal features of this vast and rather fluid phenomenon. Deities and heavenly powers generally fit into a three-level system. At the top were the powers deemed most necessary to cosmic survival. Ancient tradition includes belief in a mysterious celestial power called Shang. Eventually the word Di came to be the standard term now translated as emperor. But Shang Di was still the supreme emperor. Standard Chinese religious usage also referred to Tian, heaven, as a generic term for the region in which Shangdi lived. Neither Shangdi nor Tian was a personal deity actively involved in human affairs. They were rather the generic source of all things manifest in the universe. But there was yet another power behind Shangdi and Tian. That was the Dao, whose eternal energies of Yang and Yin are manifest in the universe and made known to humanity as the will of heaven. Also on the top level were the royal ancestors, the spirits of earth and grain. And the earth, sometimes referred to as Empress to heaven's emperor. A notch lower came the principal heavenly bodies, Sun and Moon, and Jupiter, whose revolutions of the Sun determine the ritual calendar. Rulers of earlier dynasties, patrons of farming and silk cultivation. And the spirits of heaven and earth round out the second level. Confucius was once a member of the second rank, but was elevated to the first in 1907. At the third level, CIT begins to overlap somewhat with Daoism and CCT, with their more specialized and local deities. Here are gathered the deities of fire, literature, war, artillery, soil, mechanical arts, the hearth, the granary, and the home threshold. Along with the patron deity of Beijing are three dragon deities associated with the city. Finally, several historical heroes fit here as well. A deity called Guandi or Guangong deserves special mention as a crossover figure important in more than one pantheon listing. Guandi is known by a wide variety of names, depending on the constituency of worshippers. Many people identify him as the god of war, though the red-faced, full-bearded deity is chiefly a paragon of civic virtue. The emperor had the authority to rearrange, shrink, or expand the pantheon. He could simply decree a spirit worthy of a particular rank and eventually even declare worship of that being the practice of the realm by instituting temples in his or her honor.
Have the Japanese ever worshipped the emperor? And is the emperor still a religiously important figure?
In early modern times, especially since the Meiji Restoration of 1868, Japanese governmental policy included the veneration of the divine emperor as a central element. Major institutions enshrine 20 of the total number of 124 emperors, as well as 11 princes, and focus on their worship. 7 of the imperial shrines are dedicated to honoring the spirits of rulers who died unfortunate deaths. Since the end of World War II, the role of Japan's imperial family has undergone dramatic changes from its former centrality to culture and religion. People still revere the emperor and his household as noble people, who continue to represent and uphold ancient Japanese tradition. Many venerable and arcane Shinto rituals still occur only behind the walls of the imperial palace. But fewer and fewer Japanese have much interest in those ceremonies. And the emperor no longer has the national priestly status he once enjoyed. Still, many hope a royal son will continue the imperial line long into the future. And some even dream nostalgically of an eventual return to the days when the emperor wielded considerable political power. On the whole, though, it is safe to say that most Japanese no longer regard the emperor as divine and do not think of him or his family as significant religious symbols.
What distinguishes Reconstructionist Jews from others?
Reconstructionists have sought to reorient Jewish belief from its generally otherworldly focus to greater attentiveness to the here and now. Mordecai Kaplan, 1881–1983. Led the movement and taught that Jews must understand themselves as a civilization in process. Jewish life depended on so much more than unchanging religious practice. And he introduced dramatic changes into the religious understanding of Judaism. He chose to refer to the divinity rather than to God, seeking to purge the object of prayer of its anthropomorphic overtones. Thus God is more of a cosmic process than a personal creator and sustainer of all that is. Kaplan was most influential in expanding the function of the typical synagogue to include much more than regular liturgical worship. Reconstructionism is by far the smallest of the sub-communities of Judaism, with only about 100,000 in the United States. Since many Reform and conservative Jews have come to accept much of what Kaplan taught. In general, Reconstructionist congregations retain more traditional practices, such as wearing the prayer shawl, than do Reformers.
What are some of the principal names and forms of God?
One of the first questions non-Hindus ask about the imagery of Hinduism's deities is why the multiple limbs and non-human features. Hindu tradition answers why not, since no one can know definitively and in detail what God looks like or how God operates. God sees fit to allow human beings to describe the indescribable. God is by definition beyond anything in human experience. So Hindu tradition often depicts the deity in clearly non-human form. Names of the deities always have some symbolic meaning. For example, Vishnu comes from a root that means to pervade, alluding to the divine omnipresence. Shiva means auspicious. Traditional sources often pun on the name, suggesting that without the I in Shakti, Shiva's feminine side, Shiva would be Shaiva, corpse. Ganesha's name is a compound meaning lord of the attendant Vedic deities called Ganas. Shiva's terrifying feminine side is called Kali, dark. As for their multiple forms, Hindu images of deity remind believers of the infinite variety that makes God God. As a reminder of the perfect balance of energies, most male deities have a female counterpart. A popular image of Shiva in both painting and sculpture depicts the deity as half-woman lord. One side of the body male and the other displaying the features of Shiva's consort Parvati, as a reminder of God's complete dominion over all forces and conditions, including those most of us would rather not have to deal with. Hindu deities appear in shocking and even terrible forms as well as in attractive and approachable aspects. There is a hierarchy among divine beings, a ranking that naturally develops within each denomination or sect. Among Shaivas, Shiva is the supreme deity to whom all the others defer. For Vaishnavas, Vishnu or one of the avatars heads the list.
What was happening in and around Arabia when Islam began?
In pre-Islamic times, the Arabian Peninsula had rarely been at the center of Middle Eastern events. An immense coastline made the land accessible to and from the Red Sea on the west, the Persian Gulf on the east, and the Indian Ocean on the south, but the real estate of that vast, inhospitable ocean of sand held little strategic interest for the regional powers. Local kingdoms had ruled to the north, in Syria, and to the southwest, in the Yemen. Although the Greeks and Romans knew about the place and liked its incense, they never set their sights on the territory. When Muhammad was growing up, an important trade route ran up and down the western coastal region. A highway for exchange from Abyssinia, Ethiopia, and the Yemen to Syria, and points north by way of Mecca. To the northwest of the peninsula, the Christian Byzantine Empire ruled. To the northeast, in Persia, the Zoroastrian Sasanian Empire had displaced the Parthians, a client state of Rome, in 226 CE. These two confessional, i.e. religiously connected, empires had been engaged in a protracted tug-of-war over the Fertile Crescent with its enormous river systems. Two Arab tribes in adjacent states did much of their fighting for them, namely the Monophysite Christian Ghassanids for Byzantium and the unchurched Lakhmids for Persia. As it turned out, their ongoing struggle would pave the way for the early expansion of Islam. By the time Muhammad died, Byzantium and Persia had all but spent themselves into bankruptcy and had so worn each other down that neither would mount serious resistance when the Muslim tribes advanced out of Arabia in a conquering mood.
Is there a Jewish creed?
Several important creedal formulations have appeared at different times in Jewish history. But a good starting point is the single sentence from Deuteronomy 6:4. It is called simply the Shema. Devout Jews recite these few words more often than almost any other phrase. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, or the Lord our God is one Lord. Two essential ingredients in Jewish belief are enshrined here in elegant simplicity. First, the notion that the people constitute a community of faith. And second, the affirmation of the absolute unity of God. In the next verse, Jews are enjoined to love the Lord with all their heart, soul, and strength. Another very ancient text that functions like a creedal statement appears in Deuteronomy 26:5-10. In his final instruction to the people, Moses tells them that when they come into their newly God-given land, they are to make an offering and recite a short historical summary of all that God has done for them. A wandering Aramean was my father, it begins, referring to Jacob, father of the 12 tribes. The text goes on to recount in brief how God rescued the people from slavery in Egypt and gave them a land in which to dwell. Apart from these two biblical texts, The anonymous 15th century, I believe, based on the 13 Articles of Faith of Maimonides, d. 1204, is the best known creedal statement. Each of 13 affirmations begins, I believe, with an unwavering faith. Articles 1 through 5 affirm that God is omnipotent and one, beyond all things material, master of time and space, and the sole object of prayer and devotion. Moses' prophetic authority, along with that of the other prophets as well, Scripture's authenticity and truth, and the finality of the divine law are the subjects of Articles 6 through 9. All the remaining 4 articles speak of the ethical demands of adherence to the revealed law, of the final consequences of human choices in the form of reward or punishment, of the Messiah's eventual coming, and of the ultimate resurrection of the dead.
How was Buddhism spread through Southeast Asia?
Buddhists call the spread of the tradition through lineages of teachers and students Dharma transmission. Sri Lanka was one of the first regions outside of India to form a link in the southern transmission. A lineage known as the Theravada, wisdom of the elders, was introduced to Sri Lanka as early as the 3rd century BCE. It spread into Burma and was well rooted there by about the 5th or 6th century CE. Their Buddhism benefited from the patronage of King Anuruddha, 1044–77, under whose dynasty Burma became almost entirely Buddhist. According to tradition, Ashoka's own missionaries brought the faith to Thailand as early as the 3rd century BCE. The earliest solid evidence of Buddhism in Thailand is indigenous Buddhist art from 8 or 9 centuries later. In Kampuchea, formerly called Cambodia, a blend of Mahayana and Hindu beliefs were dominant around the royal complexes of Angkor toward the end of the 1st millennium. Theravada teaching came to the fore after about 1200. But its institutions have just barely survived disastrous political upheavals of the late 20th century. Vietnam seems to have participated in the Theravada transmission early on, but missionaries from China succeeded in establishing Mahayana teaching there between about 1000 and 1400.
Have women exercised leadership among deists?
One of the most famous libationers was a woman named Wei Huakun, 251–334 CE. Her rank as libationer apparently indicates that she originally belonged to the Celestial Masters school. Some regard her as a foundational figure in the Shangqing sect. She is perhaps most famous for having appeared posthumously on many nights over a 6-year period to reveal to a certain Yangshi the sacred texts of the Shangqing sect. Those texts consist mainly of liturgical ritual. Throughout its long history, the Celestial Masters school has allowed women into the lower rungs of its ritual hierarchy, up to but not including that of Celestial Master itself. Another school, called Pure Rarity, Qingwei, is said to have been founded by a woman named Xiaoshu in the early 10th century. Centered around a thunder deity, the sect blended elements from the Lingbao, Shangqing, and Celestial Masters schools. There have been many priestesses over the centuries, and a celibate community of women maintain a temple in Kaohsiung, Taiwan. Hagiographical sources are extant on a number of holy women of ancient times. They make it clear that women who preferred to pursue the spiritual life rather than devote themselves to family risked almost certain disapproval. Even so, it seems that some women were associated with religious orders. Sun Buletin Er, 1119–1182, and her husband were both ritual specialists in the Perfect Realization Order. And she founded a new division of the school dedicated to the religious education of women. A selection of her writings in translation is available in Thomas Cleary's Immortal Sisters. Secret Teachings of Taoist Women. A sect associated especially with the red turbans is popularly called San Nai, Three Ladies. Evidently so named to honor a trio of priestesses about whom little else is known. As has often been the case in other religious traditions, many Chinese women have found possibilities for active leadership and ministry more often outside the institutional structures than within.
What other early texts are especially important for Christians?
In addition to the 27 books of the New Testament, early Christian authors produced a number of other important works. It is important to keep in mind that the formal canon of the New Testament was not finalized until around 198 CE. Previous generations of Christians may well have been in general agreement about what constituted the core of their scripture. But until the late 2nd century, some factions continued to claim the status of divine inspiration for a number of texts eventually judged to be apocryphal and thus not part of the canon. Most prominent among those apocryphal writings are a sizable group calling themselves Gospels. Some, such as the Gospels of Thomas and Philip, were an attempt to support the views of tendentious or heretical factions, while others, such as Gospels of Nicodemus and of the childhood of Jesus, purport to fill in the gaps of canonical texts with legend and lore. Apocryphal works called Acts and identified with one or another of the apostles generally, but not necessarily, reflect heretical views. Writings by a group of post-biblical authors known as the Apostolic Fathers, mostly of the late 1st or early to mid-2nd century, provide important information on the concerns and theological themes of bishops and their communities throughout the Mediterranean basin. A third significant corpus of writings dating from about 120 to 220 CE are those of authors known collectively as the Apologists. Major figures like Justin Martyr, c. 100 to 165 CE, who founded a Christian school in Rome, and Tertullian, c. 160–220 CE, of Carthage in present-day Tunisia and later Rome. Wrote in defense of Christian views when outsiders mounted theoretical or political attacks against them.
Are there any signs or symbols that might identify an individual as a Buddhist?
In most parts of the world in which Buddhism remains an important presence, it is a safe bet that many people on the street have had some direct contact with Buddhist tradition. But it is usually difficult to tell Buddhists from non-Buddhists merely by looking at their clothing or other personal effects. Occasionally you will spot an item of jewelry whose symbolism is more or less explicitly Buddhist. The eight-spoked wheel of Dharma is a common symbol easily reproduced on small-scale items. Buddhist pilgrims, however, often stand out because of the traditional garb and variety of symbols they wear. In Japan, for example, some pilgrims wear a large, round, pointed, or bowl-like straw hat, carry pilgrim staffs, and wear around their necks a small cloth wallet, in which to collect the souvenir stamps they receive from each temple they visit. Monks, nuns, and priests are surely the most obvious examples here of distinctive signs. Nearly everywhere in the world, monks and nuns shave their heads. They typically wear a distinctive habit or garb, consisting of 2 or 3 wraps, 2 for novices, 3 for senior monks and nuns. One wrap covers the lower body, another the upper. For religious rituals, monks wear a long cloth of 12 folds, sometimes called the stole, over the left shoulder. Colors vary according to region and institutional affiliation. From one branch of the monastic order or Buddhist lineage to another. Saffron is the most common color for monastic garb, but, for example, Tibetan monks often wear a dark burgundy, Japanese monks typically don darker shades of gray, brown, and violet, and Chinese nuns often wear a simple gray robe.
How did Buddhism develop in the Himalayas?
Like Vietnam, the Himalayan kingdoms, Tibet, Sikkim, Nepal, Bhutan, also became part of the northern transmission. But they're the various lineages that constitute Vajrayana, Thunderbolt vehicle, Buddhism took hold. Tibet was the homeland of this branch of the faith. With its distinctive blend of indigenous shamanism and esoteric interpretations of the Buddhist teaching. Tibetan Buddhists also developed their own extensive scriptural canon. Of all the subdivisions of the monastic Sangha that evolved across Asia, none is more varied and colorful than that of the Vajrayana. From its most famous lineage, the Gelugpa, comes the succession of holy men called Dalai Lamas.
What gender-related issues are important for Buddhists?
tradition has it that the Buddha rejected various forms of social discrimination deeply embedded in the Indian culture of his day. He is said to have repudiated caste distinctions altogether. The Buddha's attitudes toward the place of women in religion and society also represented a step forward in some respects, but many problems remained. When the Buddha's aunt, who had raised him after his mother died, asked to be allowed into the Sangha, the Buddha balked. Only after a prominent monk named Ananda took up the woman's cause did the Buddha relent. So began the Buddhist order of nuns. But female members of the order have never achieved the status of their male counterparts. There has been a breakdown in the lineage of the nun Sangha, a complete rupture. According to some historians, some women continue to live in community and call themselves nuns, but they lack official sanction. A sore point for many women has been that classical Buddhist teaching says that women must be reborn as men before having a chance at nirvana. Still, it appears that early Buddhist tradition did introduce significant improvements in the lot of many women in India. No longer merely the possessions of their men, women had a larger purpose than childbearing, had personal psychic lives and could seek their own spiritual goals. So much of the gender bias that persists everywhere in our world has a great deal more to do with culture than with any one religious tradition as such. Interaction of religious tradition and culture often makes it impossible to distinguish between the two. But it is not uncommon for people in any given culture to claim religious sanction for time-honored values and practices even when the religious tradition sources offer little support for them.
Are there days devoted to other aspects of Buddhist teaching?
On the full moon day of the third lunar month of Magha, some Buddhists commemorate Buddha's teaching of the monastic disciplinary code called the Vinaya. Thais celebrate by circumambulating the Chaitya and listening to a sermon in the temple. Theravada Buddhists celebrate the Buddha's first sermon on the full moon day of Asita, 8th lunar month, by revering the scriptural text. Some schools celebrate days dedicated to their central scriptures. For example, the denomination named after the Japanese reformer Nichiren 1222-82 honors the lotus of the Good Law Sutra, as do other groups in China and Japan. Monasteries typically celebrate anniversaries of their founding, and in some countries, a festive day marks the anniversary of Buddhism's arrival with the first missionaries. Members of the Jodo Shinshu, True Pure Land, sect remember their founder Shinran 1173 to 1262, on the 16th of each month, and with a week-long memorial every year in either January or November.
How and where do members of local Buddhist communities come together?
Temples are the focal point of Buddhist activity in most places. Many temples are freestanding institutions, while others are part of larger monastic complexes. At the heart of the temple is the primary ritual space. Some can accommodate sizable groups, but since ordinary Buddhist ritual tends to be an individual matter, central worship spaces are generally not strikingly capacious. Larger temples nowadays often have other facilities dedicated to communal functions on special occasions. People might visit their local temples individually or in smaller groups at any time on any day.
What is a golem?
A golem is a creature of legend and folklore that is also mentioned in the Talmud and in the Kabbalistic text called Sefer Yetzirah, Book of Creation. According to tradition, a specialist in the use of sacred words with magical power can cause a figure of clay to come to life by inscribing on its forehead the Hebrew word for truth, emeth. Stories from Prague's Rabbi Judah Lahu describe the golem as a helpful house servant at first. But it must be kept under control and not allowed to leave the house. Since the golem gradually grows larger and more powerful, it can be a frightening and destructive creature, rather like a Frankenstein monster. To end a golem's active life, one has to erase the letter Aleph, the beginning of the word emeth. Without its initial Aleph, truth becomes dead, meth. Stories of the golem were especially popular in the Jewish ghettos of Central and Eastern Europe. One especially grim tale relates how one golem's owner reached up to erase the letter Aleph and immobilize the creature. He succeeded, but died when the small mountain of clay fell on top of him. A few years ago, an episode of the television show The X-Files was based on the lore of the golem and told of a deceased Jew who returned from the grave in order to avenge a social injustice associated with his family.
Do Buddhists practice rituals of exorcism?
Since the Buddha emphasized that the individual was the only power of ultimate significance in the quest for liberation, he saw no need for formal ritual designed to do away with negative forces. Keen awareness of one's own motives and intentions would take care of all problems. Still, Buddhist practice has absorbed various indigenous forms of exorcism from virtually every culture in which the tradition has taken root. Many of the practices still in use in Japan originated in China and were brought to Japan by founders of Japan's Tendai and Shingon sects in the early 9th century. Japan's Nichiren school, a development of Tendai tradition, acknowledges 4 types of demonic possession. Phenomena range from pain caused by an angry spirit, to hallucinations, to possession by some animal spirit as signaled by personality changes, to severe disorders manifested in multiple personalities and voices. Priests of the Nichiren school undergo strict ascetical preparation before performing an exorcism. Someone close to the possessed person serves as a medium to the spirit world. speaking for the possessed person and delivering answers on behalf of the forces of good. In other cases, the exorcist deals directly with the possessed person. Wearing white, the exorcist recites from the principal Nichiren scripture, the Lotus Sutra. Makes sharp noises using a set of wooden castanets, and interrogates the one possessed. Some Buddhists prefer exorcism as an alternative to psychotherapy.
What does the term revelation mean?
Revelation means drawing back the veil that covers the deepest mysteries of life, thus disclosing their inner meaning. Religious traditions that explain their origins in terms of direct divine revelation generally teach that human beings are incapable of attaining ultimate truths on their own and therefore need a supernatural intervention to gain access to saving realities. This is especially true of the so-called Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Some subcommunities within those traditions are quite proprietary about their privileged and exclusive treasure, insisting that only a select few among the masses of humanity are chosen to benefit from the saving power of the divine self-disclosure. They emphasize to the highest degree the uniqueness of their elect status and seem little troubled by the notion that their convictions consign virtually the entire human race to damnation. Other subcommunities make more ample accommodation for the generality of humankind, leaving open some possibility that others not of the fold might still share in the revelation, however indirectly and secondarily. Some theologians talk of God's special revelation to their own traditions, with the broader or general revelation available to others. Alternatively, they might talk of particular and universal revelation. These concessions presuppose that those outside the fold have missed out on the core revelation through no fault of their own and are in no way actively refusing to be illuminated by it. Revelation-based traditions typically envision the divine disclosure as mediated by a series of messengers called prophets, each sent to particular peoples to reaffirm various aspects of the original message at critical junctures of history.
What rites do Shinto practitioners perform in their shrines?
When worshippers go to their local or larger regional shrines, they may engage in several types of ritual called worship gestures, omeri, depending on the occasion. A simple list of 4 P's sums up the essential ingredients of Shinto ritual: purification, presentation of offerings, petition or prayers for blessing, and participation of the assembled worshippers. For ordinary, everyday prayers, in which they express a whole range of needs and concerns. Worshippers typically perform a simple offering before the sacred presence. Alone or in small groups, they enter the shrine precinct and proceed along the path, passing beneath perhaps several torii gates, to the purification font. There they take some water to cleanse the mouth and hands as necessary preparation. A ritual action called masaji, for approaching the holy place. Moving to the front of the shrine. Worshippers announce their arrival by ringing a bell that hangs over the threshold of many shrines. Ringing the bell may be either for quieting the mind or summoning the kami. With or without the bell. All toss a coin in the offering box, then bow and clap their hands twice to summon the deity. After making a brief prayer, they bow twice, one deep and one slight bow, and then depart. For special occasions, individuals or small groups can arrange for the services of the priestly staff. Rites that last from 10 to 15 minutes take place inside the front worship hall, Hayden. Various spiritual purposes of the rituals include divine blessing and protection. The opportunity to communicate with the kami about countless daily happenings and concerns. And expressions of personal dedication to the divine beings. These services are available most days in shrines with larger staffs. For the tradition has set aside no one day of the week as a canonical day of worship. In larger shrines, the priestly staff also make daily morning and evening offerings to the kami, in addition to the various daily rites. Shrines host numerous events throughout the year for special occasions, as described above, Matsuri.
What is religious cosmology and what sorts of issues does it address?
Virtually every religious tradition has developed distinctive interpretations of how the world came to be and what it means spiritually. Cosmology, talk or thinking about the cosmos, includes traditional views about time and space and what it means to be embodied. A common element in cosmology is cosmogony or notions of how the cosmos came into being. Creation from nothing is a characteristic theme in Abrahamic cosmogonies. Asian cosmogonies include a wide spectrum of stories, from the spontaneous evolution of the primal egg, to the orderly elaboration of each living species, to the playful creative dance of the deity, to the violent sacrifice or dismemberment of the deity itself. Variations on the ancient theory of emanation have made their way into a number of religious traditions, including the Mediterranean systems influenced by Neoplatonism. Cosmologies also typically take a position on the structure or order of the cosmos, offering views as to the origins of human societies and their rituals. This world can be real or illusory, positive or evil, a work of art or the result of haphazard evolution. A mistake even the Supreme Being would like to change or the outcome of careful divine planning. A place to stay forever or a living hell to be escaped at the earliest opportunity. Time and change also occupy cosmological thinking, with linear and cyclical models forming the major options for understanding where it's all heading.
Do Hindus have a system of religious law?
Surely the single most important Hindu religious concept is that of Dharma. As a universal notion, Dharma is the cosmic law that binds all things together. Each individual person also has his or her Dharma. The fundamental religious requirements and ethical expectations associated with each person's station in life. Classical Hindu sources also use the term Dharma in reference to countless specific moral duties and ritual rubrics. Treatises called Shastras are the principal repositories of the Hindu legal and ethical materials. They belong to the larger category of sacred literature called Smriti, remembered. Revered as of divine origin, but subordinate in authority to Shruti, heard, scriptures. The Dharma Shastras, and related texts like the Grihaya Sutras that include detailed information on every facet of householder life, derive ultimately from a text generally known as the Laws of Manu, dated variously from 600 BCE to 100 CE. The ancient law books have retained their authority well into modern times. Only recently have India's legislative bodies introduced serious and sweeping reforms. But the antiquity of tradition and inherent cultural resistance to change have kept many practices alive in spite of official attempts to adapt the classics to contemporary needs.
What are the main Jewish notions of afterlife?
Surprisingly little detailed information on the afterlife is given in the Hebrew scriptures, and mostly in the very latest material at that. We find a few vague references to a nondescript region called Sheol, a grey, dreary warehouse of souls. Not a place of absolute suffering, Sheol is little more than a synonym for death itself. Toward the latter centuries of the first millennium BCE, more concrete notions of afterlife begin to emerge. Propelling the development were questions of justice such as those that the Book of Job raised. If a just man like Job suffers so much in this life, and so many wicked people seem to flourish, perhaps retribution for one's deeds will be deferred until after death.
What happens at a Jewish initiation, bar/bat mitzvah, ceremony?
Jewish boys of 13 and girls of 12 are formally recognized as religiously mature. They become sons and daughters of the commandment, bar or bat mitzvah, in rituals that acknowledge that they are now responsible for fulfilling the prescriptions of the divine law. Most communities, other than the Orthodox, celebrate this coming of age for both genders publicly in the synagogue. A central feature of the ritual involves the initiate's reading from the Torah scroll in Hebrew. Other features can extend to a much broader participation in the service, including carrying the scroll to the reading table and reciting other prayers. In some communities, a joint confirmation ceremony for 16 or 17-year-old boys and girls occurs in conjunction with the Feast of Weeks, since that observance commemorates the original reception of the Torah at Sinai. Confirmation replaced the puberty rite in some European communities. Now some Reform, Conservative, and Reconstructionist congregations practice both confirmation and bar/bat mitzvah.
Who was Lao Zi?
Lao Zi was likely an altogether legendary figure whose name simply means old teacher or master. Tradition says he was born around 604 BCE, making him a much older contemporary of Confucius. Kongfu Zi, 551 to 479 BCE, who was in turn an almost exact contemporary of the Buddha. The legend says Lao Zi was a clerk in the archives of the Zhou dynasty who practiced the way and its power and emphasized self-effacement and anonymity. When he became convinced that social disintegration and political corruption in the Zhou dynasty were irreversible, he decided to withdraw from society. Riding his water buffalo, the old man came to the frontier. There a customs officer besought him to write down his lofty teachings before departing. Lao Zi wrote the Dao De Jing, the classic of the way and its power, and disappeared, leaving a legacy of mystery. Much later stories, perhaps from a time when Daoists and Confucians were in competition for followers, tell of a meeting between Lao Zi and a youthful Confucius. No use wasting so much time studying your history, Lao Zi counseled the newcomer. Observe nature and you will see that love for the Dao is all that one needs. Popular tradition tends to identify Lao Zi as the one who first taught that ordinary folk could seek and attain immortality. Some scholars suggest that Lao Zi's legendary stature may have been enhanced as a result of his mistaken identification with the legendary Huangdi, known as the Yellow Emperor who ruled in the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE. Lao Zi was officially declared a god around 666 CE.
Is exorcism important in Shinto practice?
Demons and assorted evil influences miss no opportunity to make nuisances of themselves, especially at times when human beings and natural processes are most vulnerable. Beginnings, such as planting time or the birth of an infant, can be particularly difficult in this respect. Shinto tradition includes various understandings of how evil forces work and several methods for contending with them. Most undesirable forces are associated with impurity and pollution. Some evil spirits will depart in a ritual that designates as a scapegoat any animal or object capable of taking on the negative forces. Emperors of old rubbed a human effigy over their bodies, leaving all personal impurity on the image, which officials of the Bureau of Yin and Yang then ritually consigned to a river. Other rituals use a weapon such as a sword to attack the evil power as though it were a physical presence. Some rituals assume the evil forces have taken on demonic bodies and must be pursued and expelled from a locality. In one rite, people throw soybeans in unlucky directions and command the demons to depart. An important part of the spring Setsubun, season change. Matsuri. Some large festivals are entirely dedicated to a type of communal exorcism. An originally Buddhist rite called Goryoi, meeting with august spirits, has been associated with Kyoto's famous Jun Matsuri, for example. That festival arose out of a need to banish the spirits of disease, and eventually grew into a full-scale Shinto celebration. Another important interpretation of spirit possession has been traditionally associated with the belief that the fox is capable of changing shapes. Extraordinary spiritual states were therefore sometimes explained as a type of fox possession. Some popular traditions identify various psychosomatic illnesses as forms of possession. Soul pacification, tamashizume, is a kind of reverse exorcism in which ritualists seek to make a spirit content to remain in the body of a person suffering from illness.
What is the most important Daoist observance?
A grand affair called the ritual of cosmic renewal occurs at varying intervals in different places. It was once on a 60-year cycle, according to the ancient calendar reckoning calculated with the branches and stems. Some temples celebrate this way as often as every 10 years now. Whenever a community erects a new temple, it is time for a renewal ritual. This major festival belongs to a larger category called Xiao. Ritual specialists from the so-called Black Hat group have exclusive rights to officiate in these events. A standard feature is recitation from the Jade Emperor scripture, and the focus of prayer is on seeking blessings of all kinds for the future. Massive organizational efforts precede the larger celebrations. They include interviewing prospective high priests from whom the committee can choose a leader, who will then arrange for a full staff of ritual specialists. Full-scale festivities require extensive construction of temporary altars or shrines. Celebrations nowadays typically go on for from 3 to 5 days. Though they formerly lasted as long as nearly 2 months.
How important is ritual in Confucianism and CIT?
There is perhaps no more fundamental notion in Chinese religious thought than that of Li, proper ritual. The Chinese term is composed of two elements meaning sacrifice and spirit more precisely. Contact with the upper world combined with a character that once depicted a sacred vessel. It applies to all religious ceremony, from the most popular to the most official imperial cultic worship. Historically overseen by a ministry of rites. State rituals have generally been the most formal and precise. Pre-modern ritual practice distinguished several levels of ceremony. Supreme offerings, performed mostly by the emperor himself, addressed heaven. Earth, the forebears of the emperor and empress, and the deities of earth and seed. Middle offerings propitiated sun and moon, ancestors of previous reigns. The god of agriculture called Emperor Shen Nung, and the goddess of silk production, Lei Ziu. Lower offerings occurred in local or regional state temples and revered Guandi as deity of war, Wenzhong as deity of literature, and sage Emperor Fu Shi, among others. When Confucius spoke of Li, he had in mind all of these, plus the entire range of ceremonies enacted on a smaller scale or in private. But more than that, he conceived of Li as informing all proper human relationships.
Is there a regular, standard Shinto group liturgical worship?
Communal worship is not a regular feature of Shinto liturgical practice. People may arrive at a shrine in large numbers, but they generally do not gather to worship as a large congregation. Individual and small group worship is the norm, whether for brief impromptu visits made outside the shrine or for more elaborate priestly rituals in the worship hall. A distinctive feature of Shinto architecture is the absence of worship spaces large enough to accommodate sizable congregations. By contrast, the bigger Japanese Buddhist temples accommodate sizable groups in a single worship space. Even in larger Shinto shrines, the parts of the worship facility open to the public are in any case not fully enclosed. Being very much at the mercy of cold weather is the price of wanting a sacred space to be as much in tune with nature as possible. This also reflects the underlying sense that people build community through other activities, but perform their most intimate spiritual duties as individuals or families.
Are there any contemporary remnants of CIT?
Nearly a century has passed since the last emperor stepped down from the dragon throne, and CIT as an institution is little more than a fading memory. For many Chinese, CIT remains a historical curiosity. A large tourism industry has grown up around the preservation of major monuments such as the Forbidden City and the Temple of Heaven in Beijing. Chinese tourists flock to these great repositories of their ancient heritage. Mao Zedong and his political heirs considered the remnants of feudal and imperial society as reminders of a thoroughly discredited way of life. They are mere museum pieces to many, and relics of an oppressive past to others. But they remain important evidence in reconstructing the story of Chinese religion.
What are devils and demons? Are they all called Satan?
According to ancient Middle Eastern mythology, devils are angels gone bad. As with angels, the history of the development of devils is complex. Much depends on the ways various traditions conceive of the supreme deity. In many there has been a need to name evil forces. Since even if a tradition teaches that a supreme being has created all things including evil, it will not likely allow that the same being incites people to evil acts. The term devil typically refers to a single malevolent being of sufficient power that it may even appear to compete with the supreme being. The name Satan comes from a Hebrew root meaning accused or adversary, and first appears in the book of Job. Islamic tradition carried on the name, referring to the devil as both Shaitan and Iblis, related to the Greek word diabolos. In the Abrahamic traditions, demons are generally lesser evil forces who act as Satan's minions. Satan sends his nasty foot soldiers out to tempt whom they may. Hindu myth tells numerous stories of struggles between gods and demons. Originally distinguished not as good and evil, but as clever and not so clever. Eventually the demons came to acquire the characteristics of malevolence and ability to deceive. Countless demonic forces inhabit Buddhist hells. They are capable of assuming virtually any human or animal form and often appear in folk tales.
Are Muslim women required to veil their faces?
Use of the veil depends a great deal on cultural custom. The Quran does not explicitly require that women cover their faces. It calls for modest dress, but some have interpreted one ambiguous text - they should draw their veils over their bosoms. Quran 24:31, to mean that the head covering should continue down over the upper body. In some cultures, Muslim women wear various forms of facial covering. Whether drawn across the lower face from side to side, or covering the head completely like a small tent. Those coverings also vary in texture from a fine gauze to a fairly heavy weave with slits cut at eye level. The majority of women who wear some form of special clothing, technically known as hijab, pronounced hijab, veiling or covering, opt for a headscarf down to the mid-forehead so that it covers all the hair. Some wear a flowing gown, jilbab, pronounced jilbab, that extends to the ankles. Note that the emphasis is on modesty rather than on some specific style of covering. Muslim immigrants to Europe or the United States from the Middle East or Southern Asia might choose to continue wearing styles common in their homelands, where prevailing social norms allow greater latitude in choice of dress. Muslim women often report that they opt for fuller covering for two reasons. They seek an explicit symbolic connection with Islamic practice and they choose to make a statement of personal freedom from the general exploitation of women that they often experience in society at large.
Why is archaeology important in the study of religion?
Archaeology is the study of material evidence of cultures and civilizations. Past. It offers us a vast reservoir of data from which to reconstruct, tentatively at least, the stories of how our ancestors lived and what they believed. Armed with trowels and teaspoons, whisk brooms, and toothbrushes, archaeologists painstakingly unearth layer upon layer of dwellings, cities, libraries, and places of worship. Without the hard data of archaeology, much of our knowledge of the story of religion would be sheer speculation. Unfortunately, because human beings have so often made their homes right on top of earlier settlements, much of that data will remain buried forever. Still, there is no danger archaeologists will run out of work. Since hundreds of thousands of accessible major sites await a chance to unfold whole new chapters of the story.
Who were the Pharisees?
During the Maccabean, or Hasmonean, revolt in 164 BCE against the foreign rule of the Seleucids, a fascinating sect or school of thought called the Pharisees began to emerge from obscurity. They were called Perushim, separatists, seceders, heretics, in Hebrew. But that may originally have been a pejorative term coined by their opponents, the Sadducees. At first the Pharisees supported the Maccabees, who initially packed their new Sanhedrin with members of the sect. But the Pharisees disapproved of the way ruler John Hyrcanus, 135 to 104 BCE, attempted to secure both religious and civil authority for himself and so withdrew their support. In general, the Pharisees enjoyed the favor of the masses for their stand on political issues. Meanwhile, the new Hasmonean ruler Alexander Yane, 103 to 76 BCE, cultivated the support of the Sadducees, who tended to be aristocratic. When the Pharisees condemned Alexander's priestly conduct of sacred ritual as blasphemous, they paid with death or exile. But Alexander's wife, Alexandra, brought back the Pharisees after her husband's death, allowing them to restore both Sanhedrin and temple ritual. The Pharisees emphasized God's love for each person and taught the resurrection of the body. They stood against the priestly aristocracy in their teaching of the individual's personal relationship with God. After the Romans ended Hasmonean rule in 63 BCE, the Pharisees insisted that a separation of secular and sacred spheres would allow the Jewish people to tolerate foreign rule so long as the Romans left them their religious freedom. After 70 CE, the Pharisees disappeared as a distinct sect or party. But much of their spirit lived on in the growth of rabbinical Judaism.